This presentation represents my conclusions and is not intended to convey the opinions of the National Museum of Health and Medicine, the Defense Health Agency, or the Department of Defense. Things which appear in almost every account of the 1918 influenza, and the first, of course, is the child's rhyme above. Now, the sections of the presentation is based on the 5 W's used by epidemiologists to look at disease outbreaks. Who are the people who are affected by the disease? Where is the terrain of Montgomery County in circa 1918? When is how the disease moved through the population through time? Why and how is how influenza was spread throughout the community? And lastly, I will look at the changes of Montgomery County as a result of the disease and its continued role in understanding the disease in the 21st century. Word on the methodology. This paper is primarily based on 3 sources: the Montgomery Sentinel from 1918 to 1919, which is in the Montgomery County Historical Society, the County Death Register, which is in the Maryland State Archive, and a book called The Annals of Sandy Spring, Maryland, which was published by the community just to record the events that happened in their town. This is a digitally colorized, negative stain transmission electron microscopic image that depicts the ultrastructural details of the influenza virus particle, or viron. The influenza virus is a single-strand RNA organism. People with the flu, we now know, can be spread to others about 6 feet away. Most experts think the flu virus is spread mainly by droplets made when people cough, sneeze, or even talk. These droplets can land in the mouths and noses of people who are nearby and possibly inhaled into the lungs. Less often, a person might also get the flu by touching a surface or an object that has the flu virus on it and then touching their mouth or nose. Most adults are able to infect people beginning 1 day before symptoms develop and up to 5 to 7 days after becoming sick. Children may pass the virus for longer than 7 days. Symptoms start 1 to 4 days after the virus enters the body, and that means you're able to pass the flu to somebody before you know you are sick, as well as while you're sick. And some people are infected with the flu have no symptoms at all. The Spanish influenza broke out about 30 years after Robert Koch proved that bacteria could cause disease. Although bacteria diseases were well known to scientists who were beginning to deduce the existence of a filtrable bacteria, which eventually became the concept of a virus. While bacteriologists attributed the cause of influenza to a Pfeiffer's bacillus, scientists did not understand why the patients who had been sick with previous epidemics did not develop an immunity to the Spanish flu. It is believed that this flu, the reason it was called the Spanish flu, was because it was brought here from Valencia, Spain. In 1918, Spanish influenza was described by a doctor, quote, resembles a very contagious kind of cold accompanied by fever, pains in the head, eyes, ears, back, or other parts of the body, and a feeling of severe sickness. In most cases, the symptoms disappear after 3 to 4 days and the patient rapidly recovers. Some of the patients, however, develop pneumonia or inflammation of the ear or meningitis, and many complicated cases die, unquote. The onset of symptoms of influenza were more severe than a cold and spread more rapidly through the community. In order to protect against the disease, public health officials recommended that a person maintain a proper proportion of work, play, and rest, consuming what we would today call a wholesome, balanced diet. While the concept of social distancing did not exist, the public was warned that crowded conditions were conducive to the spread of the disease, and streetcar riders were cautioned to keep their faces turned away from others so as not to inhale air breathed out by other people. Obviously, this is a bit easier said than done. People were advised to cover their nose and their mouth when they sneeze, and every effort should be made to breathe pure air. Most of those who died suffered from a combination of diseases rather than just influenza. Army guidance in 1918 noted, quote, special attention must be paid to all cases of respiratory infection, with fever with relation to the development of signs of pneumonia. It is often impossible at the onset to distinguish between cases of influenza, without consolidation, and actual pneumonia. All cases with fever and symptoms referable to the respiratory tract must be viewed with suspicion and hospitalized, and the physical signs must be very carefully watched." Unquote. For the purposes of the study, I've included patients whose diagnosis was only pneumonia, not because I know the patients suffered from influenza, but because I cannot rule it out. In 1918, pneumonia was categorized by the anatomic location of the infection: lobar pneumonia, an infection of the single lobe of the lung, and bronchial pneumonia, which affected the lung around the bronchi. The Montgomery Sentinel correctly identified the cause of pneumonia from microorganisms such as pneumococcus, streptococcus, and, quote, by other germs with very long names, unquote. Given that influenza is an annual event in our lives, we easily forget how ferocious it appeared in 1918. Unlike physicians in Montgomery County, the Army routinely did autopsies on patients who died in 1918. Lungs of the patients who died of influenza were different than those who died from pneumonia, and comparable to those who had died from the pneumonic plague or from inhaled chemical warfare agents. These are examples of lungs removed from the patients at autopsy. The lung on the left shows the alveolar spaces, air sacs, filled with a fibrinocellular exudates and red blood cells resulting from inflammation. The illustration on the right depicts the lungs of Private H.D. Cavell, who died at the Medical Division Base Hospital 76 on October 8, 1918, from influenza and pneumonia. The picture shows what they called red lung pneumonia, which was peculiar to the pandemic. And this particular painting was made by Lieutenant William Schwartz of the Army Medical Museum the following day from autopsy. Left is a medical illustration of a gross specimen of a lung exhibiting the bronchial pneumonia resulting in interlobular pleurisy, or inflammation of the pulmonary lobes complicated by influenza. The lung specimen on the right had bronchial pneumonia and shows the inflammation and accumulation of fluids in the lungs and pleural cavity. Despite the pandemic's association with Spain, mostly since that country was one of the few not involved in the First World War, and therefore lacking censorship of the news, best epidemiological evidence suggests that Camp Funston, Kansas, was ground zero for the epidemic. One Army physician described the onslaught of patients, quote, "These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of influenza, and, when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. And after a few hours, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face until it's hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes. It is horrible. One can stand it to see 1, 2, or 20 men die, but to see these poor devils dropping like flies. We have been averaging 100 deaths per day. It beats the sight they ever had in France after the battle." Unquote. On September 19, 1918, Private Roscoe Vaughn reported a sick call at Camp Jackson, South Carolina, complaining of fever, chills, coughing, and a headache. His doctor noted that his face was flushed and his throat was congested. His heartbeat was regular, but he had trouble breathing. The physician concluded that Vaughn had influenza. 4 days later, Vaughn developed a secondary infection of pneumonia, and by that evening, his pulse was feeble and he appeared somewhat dazed. He lingered for 3 more days and died on September 26, 1918. Most patients complained of a sudden onset of the disease within several hours of one day, and usually a headache in the frontal region, pain or dull ache in the limbs and chest. Some developed a fever or shivering sensation at the onset. Most had a fever 103 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Severe cases were complicated by bronchial pneumonia, and patients had coughing fits and difficulty breathing. The stethoscope was used to listen to the lungs for pneumonia. In congestive stage, it sounded like a rattle, or a noise like crackling salt on the water, or like Rice Krispies in milk. As the lungs filled with fluid, the rattle disappeared, and breathing could only be heard through the bronchial tubes. Later, as the lungs began to deteriorate, pus formed in abscesses and passes into the bronchial tubes. A mucus gurgling sound could be heard. By race, influenza claimed a larger number of Caucasians, not surprising that white people were the majority in the county. However, proportionally, a larger percentage of African Americans died from the disease, almost double the rate of white people. There are several reasons for this. African Americans were poorer than whites and generally were in worse health. They also tend to live in smaller houses and in more crowded conditions. The other factor was age. Remember, I mentioned that there were two things found in any lecture on the history of influenza. The second item is a graph on the upper right. The typical influenza epidemics kill the very young, less than 4 years old, or the elderly, creating a U-shaped graph shown by the dotted line. Most deaths of the 1918 pandemic occurred among young adults, a group that usually has a very low mortality rate from influenza. And this is why that disease was so devastating, as young men were being mobilized, concentrated in army barracks for training, transported in confined rail cars across the country, or in crowded troop ships over to Europe. Influenza and pneumonia had death rates for 15 to 34-year-olds that were more than 20 times higher in 1918 than in previous years. This pandemic was unique compared with later influenza pandemics in that those younger than 65 had a significantly higher mortality risk than those older than 65. The large graph is the total number of deaths by age in Montgomery County. It is different than the other graph, which depicts proportion of deaths by age cohort. This graph shows absolute numbers. However, it does show the majority of deaths were children, teenagers, young adults, middle-aged individuals rather than the elderly. These were the people who mixed with people either in school or in the workplace. And I want to call your attention to the spike in the age 1 to 4 age cohort. If we separate the number of deaths by race, most of the deaths in the 1 to 4 age cohort were African American. The next spike for African Americans were school age or teenagers. Most of the deaths of white people peaked at the 25 to 34 age cohort, and these were mostly adults working in the community. In 1918, Montgomery County was beginning to transition from a rural farming community into a bedroom suburb of Washington, D.C. Most still lived on farms. Compared with other rural areas, a Presbyterian church survey of the county described housing quality 25 to 50% better than Middle Western housing. The study observed, quote, "Here a story and a half, relatively unpainted frame house of weather-beaten aspect that graces so many country roads is almost unknown. In its place is taken by a large, freshly painted 2- or 3-story house, which is most commodious and comfortable and equipped with many modern conveniences. In the upper end of the county, the homes are on the average a little smaller," unquote. The African American population was just under a quarter of the population. The study noted, quote, "While housing for African American farmers were below average of white farmers, they were significantly better than for blacks in other parts of the United States," unquote. Young adult African Americans provided a greater proportion of their population to the war effort, which was 4% of the population, versus 2% of the white population. And this is possibly due to the greater proportion of whites being farmers, which was considered by the government as critical trade. A third of the houses had musical instruments of some sort. Montgomery County improved its transportation system in the late 19th century. Railroads and trolley lines connected the county to the District of Columbia, first to move farm products and later workers to the city. During the first decade of the 20th century, the county government emphasized pavement of roads to allow motorized trucks to move goods to rail stations, which was along the metropolitan branch of the B&O Railroad. Those needing hospitalization traveled to Washington, D.C. for care. Some specialized healthcare facilities did exist in Montgomery County in 1918. Cedarcroft Sanitarium, a psychiatric hospital near Wheaton, Maryland. Chestnut Lodge Sanitarium, a psychiatric hospital in Rockville, Maryland. Starmont Sanitarium, a tuberculosis sanitarium established in 1905 in Washington Grove. Washington Sanitarium in Tacoma Park, established in 1907 by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Its first medical director was Dr. Samuel Kress, one of the protégés of Dr. Kellogg of Battle Creek, Michigan. In 1918, a maternity ward was established in the hospital and was headed by his wife Loretta Kress, the first woman to practice medicine licensed in Montgomery County. It was the only beginning to become an acute care hospital in 1918 and has now become the flagship of the Adventist healthcare system in the state of Maryland. In February of 1916, Dr. Jacob Bird established Wrenwood Hospital in Olney so he could develop a surgical practice. It was the first rural hospital in the United States, and described in a pamphlet that was raising money for a replacement facility, described the hospital as, quote, a small establishment started only 3 years ago at an inconvenient location, simply in an ordinary dwelling with few alterations, and yet has done incalculable good, unquote. It had treated approximately 250 patients in a 2-year period. Dr. Bernard Fantis, writing in an American Medical Association pamphlet published in 1918, observed, quote, one of the startling features of the pandemic was its sudden flaring up and equally sudden decline, reminding one of a flame consuming a highly combustible material, which died down as soon as the material was exhausted, unquote. When you compare the deaths of with the overall reported cases during the period, note that the number of people infected was a standard bell curve, increasing precipitously in the month of September of 1918, peaking in the month of December, and decreasing during the remainder of the winter. The influenza pandemic did not come in waves. It was an epidemic whose death rate changed with the disease as it moved through the population. However, people understood this according to the deaths, and they understood it as two waves of mortality that ebbed and flowed, creating two distinct humps. We live in an age when we receive information almost instantly. It is easy to forget that was not the case in 1918. The Montgomery County Government Department of Health collected information about deaths. Every month, individual physicians would come into the county courthouse and read their case books to a clerk who recorded the information into a logbook. The county government did not find out the toll of the epidemic until the end of the month, and it is not clear if the county compiled or even analyzed the data before turning it over to the State Board of Health of Maryland. Those records, combined with other county government records, was compiled and published long after the fact. The annual report for the public health in Maryland of 1918 was not published until 1922, 4 years after the fact. If the county and state had to wait at least a month, for most people waited till the end of the week when the Montgomery County Sentinel was published. Henry Clay Fields published information of local interest on the third page: society news, announcements, marriages, and obituaries. During the pandemic, the number of deaths were so numerous that he grouped them together in a column he entitled Death's Toll, which mostly included deaths from the pandemic, but also deaths from the war and a few other causes. It should be noted that these obituaries actually track rather well with the progress of the pandemic, with the peaks documented by the death toll columns. He gave his readers an albeit anecdotal but accurate account of the impact of the disease on the county and in real time. You may notice that on November 8th, he published more obituaries than are actual deaths from the influenza. 2 of those profiled died outside of Montgomery County, one in Washington, D.C., and one in Frederick County. However, most people learned the scope of the disease anecdotally through the deaths of friends, neighbors, and fellow church members. The Graves Registry describes the toll of influenza in one congregation, St. Mary's Church in Rockville, Maryland, and you can see a cluster of deaths attributed to influenza in January of 1919. According to the Annuals of Sandy Spring, Maryland, quote, that dread disease known as Spanish influenza was first seen in Washington, D.C. on September 1st, increasing and spreading rapidly, so that by October 1st, that the fatalities from it and its frequent accompaniment with pneumonia were numerous and alarming. September and October were beautiful months, with little rain and exquisite sunshine, while the hideous influenza stalked abroad, defying any power and skill to combat it, unquote. Public knowledge about Spanish influenza was limited on the account of wartime censorship. In an outbreak aboard a receiving ship at the Commonwealth Pier in Boston, Massachusetts, the disease had spread to the civilian population with the admission of an individual diagnosed with influenza at Boston City Hospital. The pandemic quickly spread down the East Coast, with the first fatality in New York City on September 15th. 6 days later, Washington, D.C. had its first victim, John Quire, a railroad brakeman who had been exposed to the disease in New York. There were 18 reported cases. 0.5% of the population in Montgomery County. 2 people had died, and the first of whom, a 9-year-old Glenn Coleman of Forest Glen, who died on September 28th due to lobar pneumonia and influenza. The epidemic quickly spread throughout the county, with 33 communities reporting deaths from influenza. 2 towns were especially hit hard. About a quarter of the cases in Montgomery County occurred in Tacoma Park, bordering on the District of Columbia, with 109 reported cases and a mortality rate of 9%. Gaithersburg had 46 reported cases and a 24% mortality rate. Over half the deaths in Gaithersburg were African Americans. Although the Montgomery Sentinel reported an estimated 1,200 cases, the Maryland State Board of Health ultimately concluded there were only 512 reported cases, about 1.5% of the total population during the month. 15 October, Dr. Otis Linthicum of Rockville, Maryland, prescribed for 95 patients a single day, more than he had for any previous day. This explosion of cases affected how people gathered and interacted. Church services throughout the county were canceled upon the advice of local physicians. Ministers in Rockville met and resolved to, quote, call attention to the Christian public to the need for personal, private, and public prayer, unquote. The October meeting of the Young Persons Branch of Oakdale, a Prohibition Society, was postponed until November 20th, as was the state Sunday School convention until early November. Other delays were more personal. H.J. Hunt III of Chevy Chase began a letter to the editor, quote, I have been seriously ill with influenza the past 2 weeks, but resolved that my first effort I should put forth upon getting out again would be a tribute to a memory of my dear friend from our neighboring town of Kensington, J. Dawson Williams, state senator from Montgomery County, Maryland, unquote, which of course the editor published. Montgomery County Sentinel's first mention of the Spanish flu was a single line reporting it as a national epidemic, and it was published on the first paper of that month. The following week, the epidemic hit home. Quote, the spread of Spanish influenza in the country has been rapid in the past few days, and the people in the county are alarmed. Several deaths of the disease have already been reported. Every effort is being made by county authorities and citizens, generally to control the epidemic, unquote. By the time that article was published, 23 of the 67 total fatalities for that month had already occurred. Faced with an unusually large number of obituaries, the editor began grouping together under a column titled Death Toll. And the first one was published this month. Among the dead were Phoebe Bowman, a 40-year-old African-American domestic servant, and her 6-year-old son Carlton, both of whom died the same day. Another was John Handley, age 17, whose mother, for her older sons being in the draft, he had reassured his mother that he would take care of her when he mastered a trade, only to die of influenza while residing in Frederick. Many of the county's leading physicians had become sick with the flu. William Pratt of Rockville, William Lewis and Eugene Jones of Kensington, Jacob Bird of Sandy Spring, Carlton Ethison of Gaithersburg, E. White of Poolesville, and Clifton David Bliss of Laytonsville. 2 of those physicians, Etchison and David Bliss, were dead by the end of the month, and the remaining physicians continued to care for patients, their names listed as providing care for 37 of the patients on the death records between September of 1918 and January of 1919. The Montgomery Sentinel reported that Dr. Etchison, quote, when the fearful epidemic and influenza broke out, he worked unceasingly and untiringly night and day until he was stricken with the disease which caused his death, unquote. He had been sick for 2 weeks and was thought to be recovering when suddenly took a turn for the worse and died on October 10th. He was age 32. The other doctor who died was Dr. David Bliss, who succumbed after 7 days due to the illness. He died at the age of 33. According to the Annuals of Sandy Spring, Maryland, quote, November also was as unlike November 1917 as was possible to be, with bright, beautiful days. At this time, there was a lessening of the Spanish influenza that it was hoped and believed that it was leaving us, unquote. A decrease in the number of deaths led many people to conclude the epidemic was waning. However, the total reported cases published in 1922 had 620 cases, 1.8% of the population, as the mortality rate decreased with only 16 deaths. Every day, life returned to the county as the local paper announced meetings rather than cancellations. Churches began meeting again. The county orphans court was scheduled to be in session during the second week of the month. The meeting of the YPB, which had been canceled the previous month, was now held on November 20th. The annual meeting of the county chapter of the American Red Cross was planned for November. According to the Annuals of Sandy Spring, Maryland, quote, in the early December, the dread influenza greatly increased its extent and severity, assuming a more dangerous form than in October, unquote. The total number of cases remained almost the same as the previous month, with 618 reported cases. Mortality increased to 53 deaths, which was closer to the October total. Since there are over 200 cases in the vicinity of Rockville, the school board announced on December 13th the closure of Rockville High School until after the Christmas holidays. The obituary for Washington Chichester, age 53, described an active athletic man struck down by pneumonia in the prime of his life. He had been a dairy farmer, active in Democratic Party politics, and was known for organizing local baseball teams. Another obituary for a resident who had moved to Culpeper, Virginia, expressed a shock at the loss of a man who, quote, to the day of his short illness was a perfect specimen of strong, robust manhood, unquote. These two obituaries kind of show the shock of how this disease could take down some very healthy people. Other losses were tragic, such as the stillbirth of an African-American baby boy, followed by the death of his 34-year-old mother, Sarah Jackson of Seneca, Maryland, 2 days later, both due to influenza. The Montgomery County Sentinel documented the mixed response to the apparently resurgent epidemic. The meeting of the Janet Montgomery chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution canceled their meeting for 12 December, while the ladies of the Methodist Episcopal Church south of Poolesville, Maryland, apparently of sterner stuff, announced their intent to hold their annual bazaar 2 days later. According to the Annuals of Sandy Spring, Maryland, quote, January was filled with sickness in almost all directions and little else was recorded, but hundreds of cases of influenza and the pneumonia which frequently followed it exhausted the labors of the few physicians whom the war and fatal influenza had left in Montgomery County, unquote. Fatalities increased to 63 in January, almost matching October's total, while the total number of cases decreased to 385. Over 200 cases reported in Sandy Spring that month. However, stories published in the Montgomery County Sentinel provided a sense that the epidemic was waning, as exemplified by the report on January 13th that county schools would be reopening following, quote, Christmas vacation and the epidemic, unquote. Lives were beginning to resume, as illustrated by the report from Fran Van Hossman, a county agent from Montgomery County, that after being confined to his house for 3 weeks recovering from influenza, was finally getting around to close out his work for the year for the local boys club and award the prizes won the previous year. On January 3rd, the final death toll column was published in the Montgomery County Sentinel, but almost all the reported deaths had occurred in December. Over half who died in January, a total of 36 fatalities, died within the first 10 days of the month. The impact of these deaths was exemplified by the announcement on January 10th that the meeting of the Ridgely Brown chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy had been postponed. On February 1919, had only 159 reported cases of influenza, with only 4 fatalities. There was no reporting about influenza in the paper for the month of February. The relief that the epidemic was finally over was the final report in the Montgomery Sentinel, published in March. They were describing the return of Claudia Hill to her home of her parents near Darnestown. She had worked for the federal government when she came down with influenza and admitted to the Georgetown University Hospital. Her bout with the flu was followed by pneumonia and typhoid fever. The editor of the paper noted, quote, "Her many friends and acquaintances, which she has made by her pleasant manner and as a teacher in the public schools across the county, will learn with delight of her convalescence," unquote. Death toll in Montgomery County was 224 dead from influenza and or pneumonia over the fall and winter of 1918 and 1919, a rate of 6.4 per thousand of the population. It was lower than the rate of Washington, D.C. rate, which was 7.8 per thousand, but higher than the national average rate of 5.8 per thousand. But note that the rate of influenza cases did kind of mirror the rate of influenza in Washington, D.C. And in Montgomery County, the total reported cases of influenza affected 60 per thousand of the population. One risk factor was location. Towns located along the metropolitan line of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, or the multiple trolley lines that connected suburban communities to Washington, D.C., accounted for 56% of the deaths, with another 13% residing in towns within 5 miles of a rail station. 40% of the total deaths, 28 individuals during the months of September and October of 1918, died in towns with stations on the trolley lines, which daily brought commuters to and from Washington, D.C. During the months of December and January, these towns represent 27% of the deaths in Montgomery County, since the disease has spread out to more areas of the county. Gaithersburg was primarily an agricultural town in 1918, with a rail station on the metropolitan line. Dairy, grain, and produce farmers shipped their product to Washington, D.C. by rail. Gaithersburg was particularly hard hit, with a total mortality second only to Tacoma Park. However, with a population of 625 in 1910, Gaithersburg had the highest proportion of deaths, 37 per thousand, of the population of any town in Montgomery County, and over 4 times the death rate of Washington, D.C., which was 8 per thousand. Over half the total deaths from that town occurred in October, with 11 deaths out of 46 reported cases, a mortality rate of 24%. Over half those deaths were African Americans, 55%. When you factor in the towns of Darnestown and Laytonsville, connected to Gaithersburg by good roads, there were total 12 deaths, almost 18% of the total deaths in Montgomery County for October. In November, there were 29 reported cases in Gaithersburg with no fatalities. Then the second wave of deaths, 9 fatalities in the latter part of December and January. For reasons that are no longer clear, some families were hit harder than others. 38% of African American families had more than one person die of influenza, compared with 35% of white families. And this could be a husband and wife, siblings, mother, and child. However, a small number of extended families sustained losses of 3 or more members to influenza, as illustrated by this slide. 18% of the black population compared with 10% of the white population. As the epidemic faded, Montgomery County residents continued with their lives. An advertisement for Hill's Cascara quinine bromide, which warned would-be customers to look out for the Spanish influenza and take their product at the first sign of a cold, only ran once in summer of 1919. And that was the only mention of influenza in the Montgomery Sentinel between April and September of 1919. The approaching flu season spurred planning by the Potomac Division of the American Red Cross, which included hiring of a public health nurse. Additionally, the chapter offered classes in home nursing to disseminate knowledge learned during the Spanish flu epidemic. However, the feared epidemic turned out to be much milder, with only 78 deaths in the final 4 months of 1919, compared with 508 deaths during the same period last year. A fundraising campaign succeeded in generating funds to replace the Rinwood Hospital and construction of a new facility to be ready for winter of 1919. The hospital was forced to open prematurely due to an influx of influenza cases. Although the hospital did have furniture, staff had to go into town to purchase supplies to get the hospital ready for patients. In the first year of operation, the hospital treated 19 cases of influenza, of whom only 2 died, and 40 cases of pneumonia, of whom 8 died. Rinwood Hospital would eventually become what's now today known as Montgomery General Hospital, still in Olney, Maryland. Remember that I began this talk describing the case of Private Roscoe Vaughn, who died in 1918. After his autopsy, a lung tissue sample embedded in paraffin was sent to the Army Medical Museum located in Washington, D.C., where the Hirshhorn Museum now stands. It was studied as part of a research performed about the influenza after the war, and a slide was made from the tissue block and was placed in storage along with thousands of similar samples. It was stored in a variety of warehouses, including a repurposed ice skating rink in the vicinity of 17th and Kalorama Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. In 1990, the collection was moved to a new facility at the Forest Glen Annex, near where some of the first fatalities of the 1918 pandemic occurred in Montgomery County. As the collection was being moved, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, successor to the Army Medical Museum, began computerizing their record with simplifying searching for specific parameters. Private Vaughn's case was one of the first cases found when Jeffrey Taubenberger was searching for samples that might contain influenza DNA. In 1996, Dr. Jeffrey Taubenberger began to isolate the 1918 influenza genome from the archived tissue of Private Vaughn, sequencing the complete genome by 2005. The H1N1 influenza pandemic of 2009 was caused by a similar virus. Based on the scientific and historical data from the 1918 pandemic, the 2009 vaccination campaign was focused on young adults rather than the more traditional risk groups of infants and elderly. Insights in the structure of the 1918 virus continue to inform the development of a new universal flu vaccines.